Good morning, everybody. I'm Bert Garland, shareholder at Ogletree Deacons, and welcome to This Week at Work.
Nice. This Week at Work is the only show about the workplace that offers you front row seats and a microphone, featuring experts in human resources and employment law to bring you practical, timely, and accurate insights so you can more effectively lead your organization. It's Thursday, November 9th, episode 256. Today, it's never been easy to develop effective conflict strategies, just as it's always been easier to stumble into conflict than it has been to work as a team and climb out of it. So this week, we're asking for help from Tanya Zion, who brings with her real observations from the workforce. Bert and Tanya will dissect those observations, citing research into why today's conflicts might be what they are, and who can do what to shift conflict from a detriment to an opportunity for growth. It's a journey you don't want to miss. All this and more on This Week at Work.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning, Tanya. Glad you could join today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So it's always nice to see you, and I know we have a jam-packed episode, and I'll be leading the charge today with Phil unable to make it. As the intro alluded to, there's a lot of conflict in the world right now, which is really quite a shame. And this morning, we will be focusing on conflict in the workplace specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to separate the two sometimes. And so we're really going to drill down on some strategies that you can use to figure out how to resolve that and hopefully leave with some key actions that you can take to help your workplace resolve its conflict.
Absolutely. That'll be very timely. We should definitely take the time to reflect on what we're thankful for as we move forward into this holiday season later this month. So let's take a look at the poll questions we have for our audience. Nick, you got the polls up for us?
They're up.
There we go. All right. So the first one, let's take a crack at this. Which triggers have led to conflict in your workplace this year? And we've got a whole list, whole list of change or conflict triggers for you to choose from here, A through H. So pick yours that the triggers that have led to conflict in your workplace this year. All right. Then the next one, we're going to do a word cloud, and this one is, what is one PG rated word? I stress that PG rated word that if you shouted at work would cause sudden conflict. So we want a word cloud on that one. That one's going to be pretty interesting. Hopefully we'll get a few funny responses on that one for you and I, Tanya, to chuckle about there. So as always,
I was just going to say if pineapple on pizza counted or if that was too many words. So
if you put hyphens in it, I think it counts as one word.
Okay, good. Okay.
All right. So as always, please share your thoughts in the comments section and remember to submit your questions online. All right. So this may sound too much like Thursday's version of a self-affirmation, and you all have no idea what's coming a little bit later, but it's now time for me to ask myself if I'm ready to be the lawyer on the clock. So am I ready to be the lawyer on the clock? Of course I am. Pull the lever, Nick.
All right, it's time to look into what's trending in employment law. Lawyer, you're on the clock.
All right, so good morning again, everyone. We've got 4 topics that we're going to cover, and 2 of them are very, very closely related. One will be very, very quick, and that's this first one. I just want to comment real quickly that the EEOC Democrat majority remains intact with the chair's Senate reconfirmation yesterday. Charlotte Burroughs was reconfirmed by a 51-47 vote. That means the EEOC still has a 3-2 Democrat majority with Chair Burroughs being reconfirmed. And what that means is that the EEOC will avoid 2-2 partisan gridlock that existed prior to EEOC Commissioner Kalpana Katagal's confirmation just this past July. And of course, we know the EEOC since July has been very, very active. This is something that I had cautioned our users or our listeners about for many, many, many months, that due to the expiration of the EEOC chair's terms, that it would be a while into the Biden administration before the Democrats had a majority. They've had that majority since July, and that remains intact. And that means it's a really good transition into our second topic here. And Tanya, let me ask you a quick question. I've stumped Phil on this one before, so let me see if you can do better than Phil. We've talked a lot on this program about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that's the primary federal law that prohibits discrimination in the workplace, and also has been interpreted to apply to prohibiting harassment in the workplace. Despite that, what is the one word that actually never appears in Title VII?
All right, you're making me go back to my school days here, so let me think about it. I don't think harassment is in there anywhere.
You just outdid Phil there. The word harassment never appears in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and there's never really been any EEOC guidance to employers about how to handle harassment in the workplace. There's been court decisions, but no EEOC guidance. And the EEOC, of course, earlier this year issued its proposed guidance to employers about harassment in the workplace. And they had a comment period that closed yesterday, and they've received nearly 40,000 comments in response to their request for comments about the forthcoming guidance on harassment. And so here are 5 questions that were highlighted that really illustrated sort of the flood of comments that the EOC is going to have to deal with as they craft their final version of this guidance. The first one is really, really a tough one. And the question deals with how should the final guidance handle misgendering in the workplace? The one way the agencies really tried to take a stand on this issue is by making it very clear that misgendering, which of course is defined by the EEOC as the intentional and repeated use of a name or pronoun that doesn't match the person's gender identity, is a form of illegal sex-based harassment. So although employers must sometimes make religious accommodations for employees with sincerely held religious beliefs, those accommodations don't include allowing the religious employee to create a hostile work environment for an LGBTQIA+ colleague, according to the EEOC's guidance. Now, of course, there's 2 sides to this. The proposed guidelines regarding misgendering were really a focal point of thousands of submissions. Supporters of the EEOC's position on misgendering said protecting people from transphobia is both laudable and necessary under anti-discrimination laws, while critics have asserted that what the commission proposed would violate religious and free speech rights under the First Amendment. And that would be free speech is easy to understand. I'm sorry, religious, it would be easier to understand. Free speech rights, that gets implicated because now you have the government stepping in and telling people what kind of pronouns they have to use when referring to other people. So they would argue that that's an impingement on their First Amendment right to free speech. So that's going to be really, really interesting to see how that one shakes out. And no matter what the EEOC guidance says, my hunch is that one way or another, that is going to end up in court. The next one is how should...
I have a question.
Of course, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question about that because the standing guidance from the OFCCP on affirmative action right now is that employers are supposed to make a visual determination if they don't have information on the gender of their employees when they file their AAP report. These feel in conflict. What advice would you give employers that perhaps don't have that information, or an employee refuses, or it doesn't fall into a binary category?
Yeah, I think again that the EEOC's guidance that they're looking at issuing specifically deals with misgendering, and their definition is very important there because it's defined by the EEOC as the intentional and repeated use of a name or pronoun that does not match. And so that means that an employee comes up to you or says that I want to be referred to as a particular gender, and then continuing to refer to that employee by their birth gender would be in violation of the EEOC's guidance. So I think the 2 concepts, while related, really are analyzed differently. But very fair question.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So the next one is that the EOC is really going to be wrestling with. A ton of comments came in on this one as well. And that had to deal with how should comments from abortion foes get addressed in the workplace. We all know that earlier this year, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act went into effect. That law requires employers to offer accommodations to workers who are pregnant or have a condition related to pregnancy or childbirth. And those regulations, which will be finalized by the year end, the EOC has stated that a person's choice to have or not to have an abortion falls under that law. And so in the harassment context, the EOC has taken a similar position, saying that unlawful sex-based harassment includes hostility that arises out of a person's reproductive decisions, including abortions or contraceptives. So again, a ton of comments came in on that one. The last three, I'm just going to name them real quickly. Should the final guidance specifically address domestic violence? Another one is, should employers be given more clarity on the interplay between Title VII and labor law? And then finally, should more light be shed on online harassment? So that's what the EOC, that the bulk of the comments that came into the EOC, the 40,000 comments related to those topics. All right, so I want to shift gears for a second. I want to talk about and kind of get back to what Nick was saying before, that when I started Lawyer on the Clock today, that this was going to be a quick section of self-affirmation, and I told you all that you all have no idea, but here we go. So yesterday, the Missouri Supreme Court issued a decision in the case of Brown versus GoJet Airlines. GoJet Airlines is a regional jet carrier for the mainline characters. They happen to be based here in St. Louis. And the plaintiff Brown in that case brought a purported class action lawsuit for breach of contract, saying the employer GoJet Airlines violated a bonus agreement that it had entered into with its pilots. The airline GoJet attempted to force the matter into arbitration because they argued that they had a binding arbitration agreement with its pilots. The trial court initially ruled that the arbitration agreement was invalid. The case went up on appeal. That court decision was affirmed 3-0 by the appellate court. And then that case went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. And the Missouri Supreme Court, like I said, just yesterday issued a unanimous decision saying that the arbitration agreement in the case is valid, and therefore the case must be arbitrated instead of tried in court. Now, there will be some other issues in this case that an arbitrator will have to decide regarding the validity of the agreement, the enforceability of the agreement. But as for the validity of the agreement, the Supreme Court decided that the arbitration agreement was valid. And, I'm covering this case again because it just so happens that the airline's attorney in this case was represented by yours truly and two other great attorneys from my law firm, Heidi Durr and Madeline Brown. And like I said, we prevailed on this case that we argued about 2 months ago.
I was going to say, Bert, for those of us listening to the show, we know this is another W in the column, right? So you've got to be feeling really good about that.
I am. This was a big deal, and really happy about the result of the case. All right, and then the last one we'll have a little. Thank you. The last one we'll have a little bit of fun with. I got one word for you, Tanya. Tanya, guess what I'm going to say here?
How would I know with you? Right. I'll never know, right?
Yep, this one's going to, excuse me, this one's going to come out of left field. Mocktails. So,
nice.
Yeah, so this mocktails are being advocated this year as a key ingredient for holiday party inclusivity. And of course, we know the holiday season's approaching and companies start to organize year-end gatherings. Many experts that are out there are saying that featuring mocktails to accommodate non-drinkers and cut down on the potential for bad alcohol-fueled behavior is a really good idea this season. So just take that into account as you all are planning your holiday parties. mocktails. Mocktails may be a useful thing out there.
So I completely agree with this. And if you've listened to anything I've talked about on generations, Generation Z is really turning away from alcohol. There's a ton of research around this. There's lean consumption, or they're really promoting an alcohol-free lifestyle. So I think from an inclusivity and really a risk standpoint, it's really not a bad option to offer that. And it makes people to feel included because they have a fancy drink in their hands that doesn't fuel bad decisions. But I don't know. I think it's a good idea.
Thank you. I appreciate your insight on that. Real quick question for you. Are they turning away from alcohol and turning to marijuana, given the marijuana legalization across the country, or are they just turning away from mind-altering substances?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer for that for sure. And I have a small sample size in my kids, but I think there's research out there that your brain isn't fully developed until you're 25. And so I know for those young adults, they've taken that information and said, well, wait, if I want to live to full potential, let's not mess it up. So it's an interesting idea. Now, I was at the University of North Carolina this past weekend, and it was an early game day, and there was plenty of alcohol flowing. So who knows, but those are different data points.
I was going to say, I've looked at my own kids who are in around that generation, and I think there's no shortage of alcohol around these days. I'd like to see the backup for that study there. But anyway,
So
I digress.
hang on a second now. So are we saying that now? I won't battle you on the alcohol part, but are we saying that now we're going to have gummies that don't have marijuana in it for the non-smokers or the non-marijuana takers, that at the party they can have their fruit punch, or instead of a mocktail, it's like a fake gummy? Would those just be gummy bears?
Yes, I was going to correct you on that, Nick. That would just be a bag of gummy bears. And I, for one, would appreciate that if every holiday party, there's bags of gummy bears there. All right.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
let's move.
The individually packed ones.
All right, so let's move forward. Let's take a quick look at Filbert's Forum. We're on the topic today of conflict resolution. So let's take a look at a couple of pictures here about how people view conflict resolution.
You've just entered Filbert's Forum, where we peel the onion back and take a lighter look at the workplace.
All right, so here's the first one here. This is my attempt at conflict resolution. Although, I never recommend screaming and yelling in the workplace, Tanya, but sometimes that direct approach might be preferable to the next one that we might see here. Why don't we switch to the next one, Nick, and we'll let Tanya comment on this one.
Well, for the audio listeners, we should say that is Xena. I believe it's Xena, the Princess Warrior, and she's got a very angry face. Okay.
In a full battle cry from Xena.
Yeah.
So what about this one, Tanya? What are your thoughts here?
Well, it's funny because comparing the two, yelling and screaming versus just avoidance, I think in the workplace we see avoidance so much more often. And, I've referenced Brene Brown on the show before, but, one of the things that she talks about in her workplace is clear is kind. And so both ends of this, maybe we're not being kind, right? If we're yelling and screaming and we're acting out of straight emotion, that's not very kind, nor is it clear. And if you're avoiding, also, again, you're not being clear. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today is how do you resolve conflict in a way that it doesn't have to have a bad connotation. Conflict isn't bad. It's how we deal with it and approach it that leads to problems.
Well, and I think that's a really good point there because, like you said, conflict in and of itself is not bad. That's a lot of times how really good decisions get made is because there's conflict. And conflict, if it's done properly, really should result in good analysis. And so I think that's a really important piece that seems to be missing sometimes from the workplace these days is that people are so focused on either their own position and they're dug in and they're screaming and yelling, or they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have that conflict. And as a result, we sort of miss out on opportunities for good analysis. All right, let's take a look at one last one here. And maybe this is what we need more of, Tanya.
Well, we also need to let those audio listeners know that this was a picture. I think it's a Hemsworth brother, and he's not making eye contact with anyone. And I would say it'd be hard to not make eye contact with a Hemsworth brother. Am I right? Here we go. Next.
All right. The last one here shows people, adult in the workplace, with suits on, playing rock, paper, scissors. Let's resolve this like mature adults would, but at least there, that's a conflict that may be taking place, but there's a resolution method, and nobody's yelling at each other and nobody's avoiding each other. So I think this does represent sort of that compromise that Tanya was talking about there. So, all right, well,
Absolutely.
let's move on from that. Let's head over to the Employers Lounge. And Tanya, we're going to talk to you before we get into the subject here. Let's take a quick look at our poll results. And so which triggers have led to conflict in your workplace this year? The number one response here, wow, we really got a lot of participation today, which is great, is personality clashes. 22% of the respondents said personality clashes are probably the number one source of conflict in the workplace. And I think that's right on this poll, because personality clashes is a really broad term that encompasses some of the other items that we saw in the poll. The next one at 20% is communication issues. And interestingly, everything got some sort of response. Interestingly, though, the last two, compensation and benefits and discrimination and harassment, both around 4%. I think that's a good sign that harassment and discrimination is that low. But that just shows we have a lot to do, though, with respect to managing personality conflict in the workplace. Tanya, what are your thoughts on this first poll here?
So I can't believe the results of this poll, because I think it's so in line with really what we recommend when we come in and work with organizations. The very first thing that I always do is I start with everyone taking a personality test. And if you've done any research in that, there's, if you look at Myers-Briggs, you look at that, there's about 16 personality classifications. And no 16 is superior to any of the others, right? So when we look at that, there are differences in personality. And so building up our awareness of that so that we understand, hey, this is just a different approach, and not make it personal to that individual. It's just default behavior. So how can we become more flexible in our default? And then, of course, communication issues. And then organizational change is really a communication issue, right? The right people weren't involved in that decision, or we haven't communicated it. So I think this is very much in line with what I'm seeing, and also how we attack the problem when we go in and try to address conflict issues in the workplace.
Very good. Well, let's take a look at the word cloud, Nick. What did we get on the word cloud, our PG rated word cloud? So, all right. Someone took my hyphenated advice in there, and another person just ran it all together. Banana ice cream there, but yeah, some of the favorites here are grievance, banana ice cream, rhino, no, layoff, 100% in office work, politics. I have a feeling the person who put rhino in politics might have been the same person. And then incompetent was another one that showed up in the word cloud. So very interesting results there. Well, with that, let's talk about some specific questions. We've done a really good job, or Tanya, you've done a really good job of sort of bringing into the discussion throughout some of the ideas around workplace conflict. What trends are you noticing in workplace conflict these days?
I'm noticing it's on the rise. I'm just talking to people about it more, and I'm seeing it throughout all levels of the organization. People are reaching out to say, we have a problem, and I don't exactly know what it is. And we start to break it down. It's that they're getting stuck. And so if your workplace has pockets where you don't feel like you're making forward progress, or you keep trying to solve the same thing over and over, it's very, very likely that conflict, as odd as that seems, is getting in the way. And I think the reason for that is we don't get a manual of, hey, this is how to engage in conflict. And depending on what factors are at play, sometimes we don't want to create conflict at all in the workplace, because that's our job. And we don't want to do anything that could, impact our livelihood. On the other end, sometimes we are just conditioned out in the real world that we bring all that real world conflict strategy into when we have conversations at work. And that's getting in the way as well. So from both ends, I'm just seeing a lot out there that companies, organizations, and individuals are getting hung up and not being as productive as they need to be, really because of conflict.
So what's the research? What's the research really showing as the cause for this conflict that's out there?
So I think there's lots of different things that are there. But when I look at problem solving it and I think about group dynamics, that's where I go to solve it. Because I read an article a while ago, and it was in Forbes, and they were looking at what makes entrepreneurial teams successful. And one of the key indicators that they had in terms of success or not is, have they all worked together before? And that seems like a no-brainer, but when you break down the social science behind that, it's because they've already formed as a team. And Nick, I've got a slide that's very rudimentary, but it's this idea that came out in project management. This is back from in the 1960s, and they studied and said, what makes teams like successful? What do you need to make them successful? And they went through these 4 stages: forming, storming, norming, and performing. And just for our listeners, this is kind of like a curve that starts out high and then it dips down and then it goes up. And the idea is, when a team first comes together and they're forming, everybody's really in ego, if I can, play this just a little bit, right? I'm here to prove myself. I want to make sure that I'm making a good impression. I'm doing all of those things. And then when it gets to but every team, when you come together, you have to have that storming phase so that you can get real, right? If you have read anything from the Table Group, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, that's fundamental. We have to have trust. And to get to trust, we have to have vulnerability. Well, if we don't get out of that ego of oh, I have to always be right, then we don't get there. And so what I come in and I see a lot of organizations do is they're stuck at the bottom of storming. We're not coming to conclusions in meetings. We're not being able to communicate that. My favorite, where I always know there's dysfunction, is I say, how many meetings after the meeting do you have, right? Everybody breaks off in their small groups and they're walking down the hallway having the meeting after the meeting. And that's really what we're seeing. And so to me, when I look at the science behind it, teams that are highly functional have figured out how to have conflict. So they're not storming, they're just raising issues. And I think that's a key thing to success in the workplace.
So very interesting, and I appreciate the comments there. And I think that that really does illustrate the importance of trying to manage relationships in the workplace. Tanya, do you have suggestions on actions that employers can take to help in this respect?
Yeah, absolutely. And doing a little research, it's there. A quick Google search, Newsweek is reporting on this. A lot of people are reporting on really the impact and the cost that to organizations with not being able to handle conflict. And first and foremost, it's where I'm going to start always. You guys hear me say this all the time. What are your values in your organization, right? Get really clear on how we handle conflict. Do we have communication channels where people disagree? Do we have a culture where we have leadership that are modeling this idea of good, healthy conflict? So start there. Know your values and know how to onboard your employees so they know how to function in the workplace. The second is have clear expectations, right? Because a lot of times what gets in the way is we think something's my job and someone's stepping on my toes, or we think it's somebody else's job and it's impacting me. So how do we get clear on expectations? And then finally, we need to give leaders and employees some skills. How do we have difficult conversations? How do we demonstrate the benefits of conflict? Not all can be accomplished through training, but I think it starts of clarity of why this is important and leaders really modeling that behavior.
Okay, well, that's really, really great advice, Tanya, and I concur with that. And I think that would lead to more productive workplaces, more productive teams in the workplace. So I think we're right up against the half hour here. Real quickly, we had a great question from Deb Deborah, one of our frequent listeners, and she asked the question: can you please list the last 3 big questions from the EEOC again? And those are, should the final guidance specifically address domestic violence? Should employers be given more clarity on interplay between Title VII and labor law? And should more light be shed on online harassment? Those are the last 3 of those 5 big issues that the EEOC is wrestling with as it finalizes its guidance on harassment in the workplace. So with that, I want to thank you, Tanya, for joining us today and filling in for Phil. And remember to join us next time when we'll have a member spotlight episode with Jason Nettles with Central County Emergency 911. That's going to be Thursday at 7:30 a.m. Central. Thank you again, Tanya. Thank you, Feature Group. Now go out there and do your best, folks.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link aimea.org/thisweekatwork, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.